KWCH 12 News app.
Okay, time for News Talk. It is Meritrust Monday, so we have Ashley Manning back talking about this National Financial Capability Month. They changed it. They changed the wording a little bit.
Yes, so it was initially recognized as financial literacy, but since, and we've been celebrating this since 2004, but National Capability Month basically just emphasizes the importance of gaining new knowledge, skills, and really the confidence when it comes to managing our finances.
And the confidence leads to the capability.
Right, and we make better decisions when we are more confident, and when we're more confident it's because we probably have learned a certain skill or learned some more information about money in this case.
So what if people are at home and they go, we already know what we need to know?
You know, that's great. So if you already know what you need to know, I would say take action. So if you're not taking the action, that's the next subject or the next topic. And really what you can do is just start talking about money more. I think most often we think money's this taboo subject, right? And so we aren't having those conversations. Sometimes it's easier to avoid because there's a lot of stress that's involved, but we really want to have more of those conversations. So how are you talking to your kids about money habits? How are you talking to your partner? Or if you have aging parents, how can you inform them about just different money things such as scams? Just opening the doors to more conversation.
You mentioned talking to your kids about it. I started when they were 9 years old. Because I read an article in Fortune magazine. So, but they are very financially literate now. They're in their 20s, and they've taken the bull by the horn. So I think you're right in that starting young and starting early, talking to the kids sets them up.
Yeah. You want to model that behavior you want them to do, and then you want to teach them as well. So the more you have those conversations, again, it just helps them with their skills. I think that toughest conversations are the ones with your partner because we all have different ways of doing things. So money's not binary. It's not what works for one works for all. There's different ways and we can be successful. We just have to have those conversations and be open to new ways of managing money.
I mean, everybody wants their own, a little bit of independence. So that's why it can be really tough.
Yeah. And what you've learned from your parents. So maybe you've learned like, I have to hold on to all my money, where as a spender is like, wait, no, I have to save, I have to spend it because it may be gone. So like those different values.
It's interesting how the generations are different with money. Like my grandmother was very, very, very conservative and tight with it, but she grew up in the Depression.
Right.
So life experience, right?
Yeah, it's a big part of it.
Okay, any last words?
Yes, if you are wanting to know next steps, reach out to your financial institution, talk to someone. So maybe you have created the budget, but you're like, now what do I do? Talk to someone who can help guide you on those next steps because there's experts out there. So that's my next step for you. It's just
awesome.
Talk to someone.
Awesome. Thank you, Ashley Manning. As always, we appreciate it. We'll be right back.